The Chicago Archives building stood like a sentinel of history on South Clark Street, its neo-Gothic facade weathered by over a century of harsh Midwestern winters. Inside, the climate-controlled basement housed thousands of forgotten moments frozen in time, daguerreotypes, glass negatives, and early photographs that had once meant everything to someone. Dr. Eleanor Wright adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses as she carefully examined the latest acquisition. At 47, she had dedicated over 20 years to preserving Chicago's photographic history, yet something about this particular collection made her pulse quicken. The Hadley estate donation had arrived in 3 weathered wooden crates, untouched since 1897, according to the accompanying documentation. "You're going to want to see this," her assistant Marcus called from across the room. The young doctoral candidate's voice carried an unusual edge that made Eleanor look up from her work. Marcus stood at the light table, his latex-gloved hands carefully holding what appeared to be a Civil War-era ambrotype, a photographic image on glass, popular during the 1860s. Even from across the room, Eleanor could see his hands trembling slightly. "What is it?" she asked, crossing the room. The October rain pelted against the narrow basement windows, creating an uneven rhythm that seemed oddly fitting for the moment. "It's dated 1863, from a photographer in Springfield," Marcus said, his voice hushed. "But there's something not right about it." Eleanor slipped on a fresh pair of gloves and gently took the photograph. It showed a solemn-faced woman in mourning dress, standing behind a seated child of perhaps 5 or 6 years. Standard composition for the era, the long exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still, explaining their serious expressions. "The quality is remarkable," Eleanor murmured, "but I don't see what's troubling you." Marcus tapped the computer screen beside them. "I scanned it at high resolution. Look closer at the child's face." Eleanor leaned toward the monitor as Marcus zoomed in. The child's features came into sharp focus, and Eleanor felt a chill travel up her spine. While the mother's face maintained the frozen dignity common to Civil War photography, the child's expression was different. The eyes seemed to be looking directly at the camera with an awareness that felt impossible for the technology of the time. "Could be a coincidence," Eleanor said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "Early photography has plenty of oddities." "That's not all," Marcus continued, zooming in further. "Look at the child's hands." Eleanor squinted at the screen. The child's fingers appeared to be in motion, blurred in a way that suggested movement during the exposure, which typically lasted several seconds. But what caught Eleanor's attention was what appeared to be writing on the child's palm, just barely visible beneath the blur. "Can you enhance that?" she asked, pointing at the screen. Marcus adjusted the contrast and sharpness. The writing became clearer. "Find me some kind of photographic anomaly," Eleanor said firmly, though her academic certainty wavered. "Or perhaps a darkroom trick. Many early photographers experimented with—" "Dr. Wright," Marcus interrupted. "There's more. The donation records show this came from a family whose child disappeared in 1863. The mother commissioned this photo the day before the disappearance. It was the last image taken of them together." The basement suddenly felt colder as thunder rolled outside. Eleanor stared at the faces in the photograph, the stoic mother and the child with the impossible gaze. "We should document this properly," she said finally, her professional demeanor reasserting itself despite the unease crawling across her skin. "Check the collection for any related correspondence or news clippings." As Marcus turned away, Eleanor found herself unable to look away from the child's eyes. For a moment, just a fleeting instant, she could have sworn they blinked on the screen. The following morning brought clear skies, but did nothing to dispel the unease that had settled over Eleanor. She dreamt of the photograph, of standing in the studio where it was taken, watching the photographer disappear beneath his black cloth while the mother and child remained motionless before the camera. In the dream, the mother had whispered something just as Eleanor woke, leaving her with a lingering sense of dread. The archives were quiet when she arrived at 7:30 a.m., well before the building officially opened. Eleanor preferred these solitary hours when she could work without interruption. Today, however, the silence felt oppressive. She made her way to the research room where they'd left the Hadley materials. The ambrotype sat in a protective case on the examination table alongside Marcus's preliminary notes. Eleanor picked up his research summary, quickly scanning his findings. Child identified as Elizabeth Hadley, age 6. Mother is Catherine Hadley, widow of Union Captain James Hadley, killed at Gettysburg, she read aloud, her voice echoing slightly in the empty room. The disappearance had occurred on October 17, 1863, almost exactly 162 years ago to the day. According to newspaper clippings Marcus had located online, Elizabeth had vanished from her bed during the night. Despite extensive searches, no trace of the child was ever found. Catherine Hadley had died 3 years later, reportedly from grief. Eleanor set down the notes and turned to the photograph. Something about the timing felt significant. The anniversary of the disappearance coinciding with their discovery of the image. She pulled out her phone and took several pictures of the ambrotype, intending to examine them more closely later. As she reviewed the images on her screen, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. In her phone's version of the photograph, the child's position appeared slightly different, the head tilted at a different angle than she remembered. "That's not possible," Eleanor muttered, looking between her phone and the original ambrotype. The positions matched perfectly now. She blinked hard, attributing the discrepancy to poor sleep and the strange dreams that had plagued her. The sound of the security door buzzing announced Marcus's arrival. He appeared in the doorway moments later, carrying 2 coffee cups and looking as tired as Eleanor felt. "I couldn't stop thinking about it," he admitted, handing her a cup. "I did some digging into the Hadley family last night." "Find anything interesting?" Eleanor asked, grateful for both the coffee and the distraction from her troubling observations. "The house where the child disappeared still exists," Marcus said. "It's in the Lincoln Park area, been renovated several times, but the original structure remains. And get this, it's been on and off the market for years because no one stays there long." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, ghost stories." "Nothing so dramatic, just unexplained occurrences according to real estate blogs. Cold spots, strange noises, the usual claims. But here's the interesting part," he continued, pulling out his tablet and bringing up a web page. "The current owners have been trying to sell for 3 years with no success. They've slashed the price repeatedly. And you think this is connected to our photograph?" "I think it's worth investigating," Marcus replied. "The coincidence of finding this photo almost exactly 162 years after the disappearance seems significant. And there's something else." He pulled a small evidence bag from his pocket and carefully removed what appeared to be a folded piece of yellowed paper. "This was tucked into the backing of the frame. I found it last night after you left." Eleanor took the fragile paper and gently unfolded it. The handwriting was faded, but still legible, a woman's careful script. "My dearest Elizabeth, if you are found, return to where we last embraced. I will wait for you always. Mother." A chill ran through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the archive's temperature control. She looked back at the photograph, at the solemn face of Catherine Hadley, and felt an unexpected connection to the woman's loss. "We should visit the house," she found herself saying. "For research purposes, of course. The architectural elements might provide context for the photograph." Marcus nodded, clearly relieved that she was taking his interest seriously. "I can contact the real estate agent today." As they discussed logistics, neither noticed the subtle change in the ambrotype sitting on the table between them. The child's hand, previously blurred, now clearly visible with palm outstretched toward the viewer. The Hadley house stood on a tree-lined street in Lincoln Park, an elegant Victorian somewhat dwarfed by the newer, more ostentatious homes surrounding it. Despite multiple renovations over the decades, it maintained much of its original character. The ornate woodwork around the windows, the steep pitched roof, the narrow front porch with delicate spindlework. "It's smaller than I expected," Marcus commented as they approached the wrought iron gate. The autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet, and Eleanor pulled her coat tighter against the October chill. "Grand for its time, though," she replied. "Remember, this would have been considered a substantial home for a captain's widow in the 1860s. The real estate agent, a woman named Diane Summers, waited on the porch. Her professional smile seemed slightly strained as she greeted them. "Dr. Wright, Mr. Calloway, so pleased you could make it. I understand you're researching the home's original owners?" "Yes, for the Chicago Historical Archives," Eleanor confirmed. "We've recently acquired some materials related to the Hadley family." "Oh, fascinating," Diane said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "Well, the current owners are quite motivated to sell, so they're happy to accommodate any interest in the property. Shall we?" The interior was an uncomfortable blend of modern amenities and preserved historical elements. Original hardwood floors had been restored to a high shine, while the kitchen had been completely remodeled with stainless steel appliances and marble countertops. The formal dining room retained its original chandelier, now electrified, but still recognizably Victorian. "The previous owners discovered the original wallpaper during renovations," Diane explained, gesturing to a framed section of faded floral pattern mounted on the dining room wall. "They preserved this sample as a nod to the home's history." Eleanor examined the wallpaper fragment with professional interest, noting the distinctive pattern popular in the 1860s. Marcus, meanwhile, had wandered toward the main staircase, his gaze fixed on the second floor. "The master bedroom and two smaller bedrooms are upstairs," Diane continued, following his gaze. "The third floor was originally servants' quarters but has been converted to a home office." "Could we see the bedrooms?" Eleanor asked, remembering that Elizabeth had disappeared from her bed. "Of course." Diane led them up the creaking staircase, her heels clicking against the wood. "The smallest bedroom is currently set up as a guest room, but it was likely the child's room originally, based on the dimensions." The room in question was at the end of the hallway, a modest space with a single window overlooking the backyard. Despite the cheerful yellow paint and modern furnishings, Eleanor felt a distinct heaviness upon entering. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, though no windows were open. "Drafty in here," Diane commented, rubbing her arms. "These old houses, you know, never quite as energy efficient as new construction." Marcus had moved to the window, looking down at what would have been the garden in Elizabeth's time. According to the newspaper accounts, there were no signs of forced entry the night she disappeared. The mother insisted that no one could have taken her daughter without her knowledge. Their bedrooms were connected by a door. "Yes, that would be this," Diane said, indicating a door in the side wall that now opened into a walk-in closet. The master bedroom was reconfigured in the 1950s, so the connection was repurposed. Eleanor approached the closet, a strange compulsion drawing her forward. The modern sliding doors seemed out of place against the original woodwork of the frame. She reached for the handle, feeling an inexplicable trepidation. The closet was dark, the motion sensor light failing to activate as she slid the door open. Eleanor fumbled for a switch on the wall, but before she could find it, a distinct chill enveloped her, far colder than the draft they'd noticed earlier. "There should be a pull cord," Diane said from behind her, but her voice sounded distant, as if coming from much farther away than the few feet that separated them. Eleanor reached into the darkness, feeling for the cord. Her hand brushed against something cold and solid that shouldn't have been there. She jerked back instinctively, but not before feeling what seemed like small, icy fingers grasp her wrist. She stumbled backward, colliding with Marcus, who had moved to her side. The closet light suddenly flickered on, revealing nothing but neatly arranged shelves and hanging rods. "Dr. Wright, are you all right?" Marcus asked, steadying her. Eleanor stared at her wrist, where 5 tiny red marks were already forming, like fingerprints pressed too hard against her skin. "Just lost my balance," she lied, pulling her sleeve down to cover the marks. "These old houses have uneven floors." Diane was watching her with an odd expression, part concern, part resignation. "You felt it too, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "It's why we can't sell the house. Not everyone experiences it, but those who do, they never make an offer." "Experiences what exactly?" Marcus asked, his academic skepticism giving way to genuine curiosity. Diane hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "The current owners never stay here overnight anymore. They tried when they first bought the place 3 years ago, but after what happened to their daughter—" "What happened?" Eleanor prompted, rubbing her wrist where the skin still burned cold. "She started talking about a friend named Elizabeth who lived in her closet," Diane said softly. "A friend who wanted to go home but couldn't find her mother. After the sleepwalking incidents, they moved to a condo downtown and listed the house." The name sent a shiver through Eleanor. Outside, the afternoon had grown darker as clouds gathered, casting the small bedroom in gloomy shadow. "We should go," Marcus said suddenly, his earlier enthusiasm dampened. "We've taken enough of Miss Summer's time." Eleanor nodded, but as they turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of movement in the closet through the corner of her eye, a small shadow that darted out of sight when she turned to look directly at it. On the drive back to the archives, neither of them spoke about what they had experienced. The marks on Eleanor's wrist had faded to barely visible pink lines, but the sensation of those cold fingers lingered. The archives were closing when they returned, the day staff packing up to leave. Eleanor nodded to her colleagues as she and Marcus made their way to the basement research room, neither willing to discuss their experience at the Hadley house until they were alone. "You saw something," Marcus said once the heavy door closed behind them. It wasn't a question. Eleanor sank into a chair, suddenly feeling every one of her 47 years. "I'm not sure what I felt in that closet," she admitted. "It could have been anything, an exposed nail, a coat hanger. And the marks on your wrist, just coincidentally shaped like a child's fingerprints?" She didn't answer, instead turning to the materials they'd left on the table that morning. The ambrotype sat in its protective case, seemingly unchanged. Eleanor reached for it, then hesitated. "Let's check the scan you made yesterday," she said instead. "I want to compare it with the physical photograph." Marcus nodded and moved to the computer. A few keystrokes brought up yesterday's high-resolution scan. They both leaned forward to examine it, and Eleanor felt her breath catch. "That's not right," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The child's position is different." In yesterday's scan, Elizabeth Hadley sat stiffly beside her mother, one hand clearly visible in her lap, the other raised slightly with the words "Find me" barely discernible on her palm. In the ambrotype now sitting on their table, both the child's hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her head was tilted slightly toward her mother instead of facing the camera. "Could you have scanned a different photograph?" Eleanor suggested, though she knew the answer before Marcus shook his head. "There's only one ambrotype of a mother and child in the collection. This has to be it." He looked up at her, his academic detachment crumbling. "Dr. Wright, what's happening here?" Eleanor reached for the photograph with trembling hands. As her fingers touched the protective case, the overhead lights flickered briefly, plunging the basement into momentary darkness. When they came back on, both researchers were staring at the ambrotype, where the child now appeared to be standing behind the seated mother, one hand resting on the woman's shoulder, the other pointing directly at the viewer. "This isn't possible," Eleanor whispered, scientific certainty warring with the evidence before her eyes. Marcus was already reaching for his phone. "I'm taking another picture. We need to document this." Before he could capture the image, the lights flickered again, longer this time. In the darkness, Eleanor felt a distinct drop in temperature and a subtle pressure change, as if the air in the sealed room had suddenly been displaced. When the lights returned, the ambrotype showed the original composition, mother standing, child seated. But now both figures seemed to be looking directly at them, with an awareness that defied the photographic technology of the 1860s. "We need to leave," Marcus said, backing away from the table. "Whatever this is, we're interfering with something we don't understand." Eleanor couldn't disagree, but neither could she abandon her professional responsibility. "We can't just leave the collection unsecured, and we need to understand what's happening here." As if in response to her words, the computer screen suddenly came to life, displaying a series of rapidly changing images, all scans from the Hadley collection. The images flickered past too quickly to process until they stopped on a photograph of the Hadley house as it appeared in the 1860s. In the upper window, the window of what would have been Elizabeth's bedroom, a small, pale face was clearly visible, one hand pressed against the glass. The temperature in the room plummeted further, their breath now visible in the air. The note they had found in the photograph's frame, Catherine Hadley's message to her lost daughter, lay on the table, and Eleanor watched in disbelief as invisible fingers smoothed out its creases. "My dearest Elizabeth, if you are found, return to where we last embraced. I will wait for you always, Mother." The words seemed to hang in the frigid air. And suddenly, with absolute certainty, Eleanor understood. "The child never left the house," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "She's still there, waiting to be found." Marcus looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Dr. Wright, you can't possibly believe—" "I don't know what I believe anymore," Eleanor interrupted, "but I know what we experienced in that house. And I know this photograph is trying to tell us something." She turned back to the ambrotype, where the child's image had changed once more. Elizabeth now stood alone in the frame, her mother no longer visible. The background had shifted as well, showing not a photographer's studio, but what appeared to be the interior of a closet. The child's expression remained solemn, but her eyes held a pleading quality that transcended the photographic medium. "She wants to be reunited with her mother," Eleanor said softly. "That's what the note means. Return to where we last embraced." "Even if that's true, how would we possibly help?" Marcus asked. "This happened over 160 years ago. Catherine Hadley is long dead." Eleanor stared at the photograph, remembering the cold touch in the closet, the 5 small fingerprints on her wrist. "I don't think that matters to Elizabeth. Time might not work the same way for her." Outside, the October rain had returned, pelting against the narrow basement windows. Thunder rolled in the distance, and the overhead lights flickered once more. "We need to go back to the house," Eleanor said, her decision made. "Tonight." Darkness had fully descended by the time Eleanor parked her car a block from the Hadley house. The rain had intensified, transforming the street into a shimmering ribbon beneath the glow of widely spaced street lamps. Most of the neighboring homes displayed warm light from within, but the Hadley house stood dark and unwelcoming against the night sky. "This is trespassing," Marcus pointed out as they approached the property, huddled beneath a shared umbrella. "Not to mention potentially career-ending if we're caught breaking into a historical home." We're not breaking in," Eleanor corrected, pulling a business card from her pocket. "Diane gave me her number. I called while you were gathering the materials." Marcus looked surprised. "And she agreed to let us in? At night, during a storm?" "I told her we needed to check something about the architectural features in a specific light condition. She was skeptical, but ultimately agreed when I mentioned the university might be interested in purchasing the property for preservation." Eleanor avoided his gaze. "I may have implied we had more institutional backing than we actually do." They reached the gate, which creaked open at Eleanor's touch. The front yard was smaller than it appeared in the historical photograph, modern property divisions having reduced the original plot size. The porch light flickered on as they approached, activated by a motion sensor. Diane's car was already in the driveway, and she opened the door before they reached the porch. Her professional demeanor had given way to obvious discomfort. Dr. Wright, Mr. Calloway. She greeted them stiffly. I've turned on the lights for you, but I won't be staying. The owners have authorized a 1-hour visit, no more. She handed Eleanor a set of keys. Please lock up when you leave and drop these in my office mail slot. The alarm is already disabled. You're not staying? Marcus asked, sounding more anxious than Eleanor had ever heard him. Diane shook her head firmly. I don't come here after dark, not anymore. She hesitated, then added, whatever you're really doing here, be careful. This house doesn't like being disturbed. Before either of them could respond, Diane hurried to her car, leaving them standing in the doorway of the silent house. Well, that was ominous, Marcus muttered as they stepped inside. The entryway looked different at night, the tasteful modern lighting casting strange shadows across the original woodwork. Eleanor closed the door behind them, shutting out the sound of rain and leaving them in a silence that felt oddly pressurized, as if the house itself were holding its breath. We should start in Elizabeth's room, Eleanor said, leading the way toward the staircase. She carried a small bag containing the ambrotype in its protective case and Catherine Hadley's note. As they climbed the stairs, Eleanor noticed Marcus constantly checking his phone. No signal, he confirmed when he caught her looking. Not surprising in this weather, I guess. The upstairs hallway stretched before them, the door to Elizabeth's former bedroom visible at the far end. Unlike their daytime visit, all the doors along the corridor stood slightly ajar, as if inviting inspection. The air felt heavier with each step they took toward Elizabeth's room. The yellow paint that had seemed cheerful in daylight now appeared sickly under the artificial lighting. The guest room furniture, a queen bed, a nightstand, a small writing desk, seemed out of place, as if superimposed on a different reality. The closet, Eleanor said, moving toward the sliding doors. That's where I felt the presence. Marcus hung back, his academic skepticism clearly at war with his unease. What exactly are we hoping to accomplish here, Dr. Wright? We can't actually believe we're going to help a ghost find her mother. Eleanor turned to face him. I don't know what I believe anymore, Marcus, but I know what I felt in this house, and I know what we both saw happen to that photograph. Something is connecting these events across time, and it centers on this room, on this closet. She reached into her bag and removed the ambrotype and the note. The photograph had changed again since they left the archives. Now it showed only the child, standing alone in what appeared to be this very room, though as it would have looked in the 1860s. I think we need to return these to where they belong, Eleanor said, sliding open the closet door. The motion sensor light failed to activate, just as it had during their previous visit. The closet interior remained dark, but Eleanor could make out the back wall, seemingly closer than it should have been given the room's dimensions. She stepped forward, feeling the same cold that had enveloped her earlier. Behind her, Marcus switched on his phone's flashlight, illuminating the shallow space. The modern shelving and hanging rods looked strangely insubstantial, as if they might fade away at any moment. There's something behind this wall, Eleanor said, pressing her palm against the back panel of the closet. It feels hollow. Marcus directed his light to where she was touching. It could be a sealed doorway. The house has been renovated multiple times. Eleanor ran her fingers along the edges of the panel, feeling for any irregularity. Near the bottom, her hand encountered a slight protrusion, barely noticeable unless specifically searching for it. There's some kind of latch or handle here, she said, bending down to examine it more closely. As her fingers closed around the small metal fitting, the house's electrical system surged. The lights brightened to an almost painful intensity, then plunged them into complete darkness. The sudden silence suggested a power outage affecting the entire block. "Marcus!" Eleanor called, her voice sounding muffled in the closet's confines. "I'm here," he answered, his phone light cutting through the darkness once more. "Power's out. We should probably leave." Eleanor turned back to the panel, a strange certainty guiding her actions. "Not yet. Help me with this." Together, they applied pressure to the hidden latch. The panel resisted briefly, then swung inward with a groan of long undisturbed hinges, revealing a small, dark space beyond. A hidden room, or perhaps a forgotten section of the original closet that had been walled off during renovations. The air that escaped from the opening was stale and cold, carrying a faint scent of lavender and something else, a medicinal smell reminiscent of camphor. Marcus directed his light into the space, revealing peeling wallpaper with the same pattern they had seen preserved in the dining room. "This is original to the house," Eleanor whispered, stepping carefully into the hidden space. It was just large enough for a small child to hide in, or to be hidden. The beam of Marcus's flashlight illuminated something on the floor, a small, dark object that at first appeared to be a bundle of cloth. As Eleanor knelt beside it, she realized with a shock that it was a child's dress, preserved in the sealed space for over a century and a half. Beside it lay a small porcelain doll with a cracked face, its painted eyes staring sightlessly upward. "My God," Marcus breathed. "Do you think—" Before Eleanor could respond, the temperature in the small space plummeted. Their breath clouded before them, and the light from Marcus's phone began to flicker. Eleanor gently placed the ambrotype and Catherine Hadley's note beside the dress and doll. "We've found you, Elizabeth," she said softly. "We've brought your mother's message." The phone light died completely, leaving them in absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, Eleanor felt rather than heard a presence moving in the space between them. A cold pressure brushed against her cheek, the ghost of a small hand reaching out in gratitude or farewell. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, they heard the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, distant at first, then fading to nothing, as if receding through layers of time. Light suddenly flooded the space as the house's power returned. Eleanor blinked against the brightness, then looked down at where she had placed the photograph and note. Both were gone. In their place lay a small gold locket, tarnished with age but clearly valuable. A mother's keepsake, perhaps, meant for a daughter who had never received it. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a crystalline autumn day. Eleanor sat in her office at the Archives, the gold locket resting on her desk beside a stack of police reports. Marcus stood by the window, looking out at the university campus spread below them. "Detective Ramirez says they'll send a forensic team to examine the hidden space today," Eleanor said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since they'd left the Hadley house. "They're treating it as a potential historical crime scene." Marcus nodded without turning. "And our story? That we were conducting architectural research when we discovered the hidden closet." Eleanor picked up the locket, feeling its weight in her palm. No mention of photographs that change or ghost children who disappear after being found. "Do you think they'll find her remains?" Marcus asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question. The dress and doll certainly suggested Elizabeth had been in that space, but whether by accident or design remained unclear. Possibly. If so, she'll finally get a proper burial. The locket's clasp resisted briefly, then yielded to Eleanor's careful pressure. Inside was a tiny daguerreotype of Catherine Hadley, smiling in a way she hadn't in the formal portrait with her daughter. On the opposite side, a lock of light-colored hair was secured beneath a small glass panel. "A memorial piece," Eleanor murmured. "Mothers often kept locks of their children's hair, especially if the child died young. But in this case, the mother created it before the child disappeared," Marcus pointed out, finally turning from the window, as if she knew what was going to happen. The implication hung between them, neither willing to voice the darker possibility that Catherine Hadley might have been responsible for her daughter's fate. The historical record offered no answers, only the fact of a child's disappearance and a mother's subsequent decline into grief and death. "The ambrotype is gone," Eleanor said, changing the subject. "I checked the collection this morning. No record of it ever existing except in Marcus's scan." "Which has also disappeared from the server," Marcus added. "I checked twice. It's as if we never found it. Eleanor opened her desk drawer and removed a folder containing printouts of Marcus's research notes and a copy of the newspaper article about Elizabeth's disappearance. These, at least, remained as evidence of what they had investigated. "Diane Summers called while you were checking the servers," she told Marcus. "The owners received an offer on the house this morning. Full asking price, no conditions. The buyers are a young couple with a daughter about Elizabeth's age." "That can't be a coincidence," Marcus said, frowning. "Should we warn them?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. What would we say? That we exorcised a ghost by returning a photograph and a note to a hidden closet? That we heard a child's laughter fading into history? "When you put it that way," Marcus sighed, "I still can't believe what happened. Nothing in my academic training prepared me for any of this." "Nor mine," Eleanor admitted. "But perhaps that's the point. Some things exist beyond our frameworks of understanding, beyond archival records and historical documentation." She closed the locket and placed it in a small evidence bag, labeling it with the date and location of discovery. Whatever happened next would be in the hands of the police and, eventually, museum curators who would catalogue the locket as a historical artifact with no knowledge of its true significance. "What will you tell people who ask about the Hadley collection?" Marcus asked. Eleanor smiled slightly. "The truth, more or less, that we discovered some interesting materials relating to a Civil War-era family, and that our research led to the discovery of a previously unknown architectural feature in their former home." "And if they ask about the photograph?" "What photograph?" Eleanor replied, her academic mask firmly back in place. "There's no record of any ambrotype of Catherine and Elizabeth Hadley in our collection." As Marcus gathered his things to leave, Eleanor found herself thinking about the sound they had heard in the darkness, that fading laughter that seemed to cross the boundaries of time itself. Had Elizabeth Hadley finally found her way back to her mother after 162 years of waiting? Or had they simply witnessed the resolution of a tragedy that had imprinted itself on the fabric of that house? Eleanor knew she would never have the answer. Some mysteries, once encountered, remained forever in that liminal space between knowledge and belief, between the documented facts of history and the deeper truths that no archive could preserve. 3 weeks after their discovery at the Hadley house, Eleanor found herself standing before an attentive audience in the university's main lecture hall. Her presentation, titled "Photographic Preservation and Historical Discovery, the Hadley Collection," had drawn a larger crowd than usual for the department's monthly colloquium. Word had spread about the hidden room and the subsequent police investigation, generating interest beyond academic circles. The daguerreotypes and ambrotypes in the Hadley collection provide valuable insight into middle-class life during the Civil War era, Eleanor explained, clicking through slides of the photographs they had catalogued. Particularly notable is the documentation of mourning practices following the death of Captain James Hadley at Gettysburg. She deliberately made no mention of the photograph that had started their investigation, the one that no longer existed in their archives or in any digital record. Yet its absence felt palpable to Eleanor as she continued her presentation, describing their research process and the architectural discovery that had resulted from it. "The concealed space we found appears to have been created during renovations in the 1870s, after Catherine Hadley's death," she said, showing a floor plan of the house. "Current forensic analysis suggests the space was intentionally sealed, possibly to conceal evidence related to Elizabeth Hadley's disappearance in 1863. A hand rose from the middle of the audience. "Dr. Wright, have the police determined whether the child's remains were in the hidden closet?" Eleanor had expected this question. "The police investigation is ongoing, but I can confirm that human remains were discovered in the sealed space. DNA testing is being conducted to confirm identity, though historical records strongly suggest they belong to Elizabeth Hadley." Another audience member, a colleague from the history department, spoke up. The newspaper accounts from 1863 suggest a thorough search of the house was conducted after the child's disappearance. How could investigators have missed a hiding place within the child's own closet? An excellent question, Eleanor acknowledged. Based on the construction of the hidden space, we believe it was deliberately designed to be overlooked. The access panel matched the surrounding wall perfectly. Additionally, historical records indicate that Catherine Hadley became increasingly reclusive after her daughter's disappearance, limiting access to the upper floors of the home. By the time of her death in 1866, few people had been admitted to the child's bedroom for any reason, Eleanor continued. She could see Marcus sitting in the back row, his expression carefully neutral. They had agreed to present only the documented facts, avoiding any mention of their more inexplicable experiences. Yet Eleanor found herself wondering how many other historical mysteries might have similar supernatural dimensions, dimensions that remained unexplored because they fell outside academic methodology. After concluding her formal presentation, Eleanor fielded additional questions from the audience, most focused on the technical aspects of photographic preservation or the historical context of the Hadley family. As the event wound down, a woman approached the podium, elderly, elegantly dressed, with alert eyes that studied Eleanor with unusual intensity. "Dr. Wright, my name is Margaret Carrington," she introduced herself. "I believe we need to speak privately about your discovery." Something in the woman's tone gave Eleanor pause. "Of course, my office hours are—" "Now, if possible," Margaret interrupted gently. "What I have to share won't wait." Intrigued, Eleanor nodded and led the woman to a small conference room adjacent to the lecture hall. Marcus noticed their departure and followed discreetly, joining them after Eleanor beckoned him inside. "This is my research assistant, Marcus Calloway," Eleanor explained. "He was instrumental in the Hadley investigation." Margaret acknowledged him with a nod before opening her handbag and removing a small leather-bound journal. "I am Catherine Hadley's great-grandniece. This journal belonged to her sister, my great-grandmother Emma Hadley Carrington." Eleanor and Marcus exchanged glances. They had found no record of Catherine having a sister in their research. "Emma was significantly younger than Catherine," Margaret explained, noticing their confusion. "She was only 12 when Elizabeth disappeared, but she documented the events and their aftermath meticulously." She placed the journal on the table between them, including what really happened to Elizabeth. Eleanor stared at the journal, her academic interest warring with an inexplicable dread. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward it. Margaret nodded. "That's why I've brought it. When I read about your discovery in the newspaper, I knew it was time for the truth to emerge. The journal's leather was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle." Eleanor carefully opened it to where a ribbon marker had been placed. The handwriting was neat, but clearly that of a young person, with occasional ink blots and crossed-out words. "October 18th, 1863, Eleanor read aloud. "They have searched everywhere for Elizabeth, but cannot find her. Catherine refuses to leave her room. Father says she is overcome with grief, but I heard her speaking to someone last night when I passed her door. She was saying, 'You'll be safe there until I join you. No one will ever separate us again.'" Eleanor looked up at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Continue." "October 20th, the searchers have given up hope of finding Elizabeth alive. They believe she was taken by someone passing through town, perhaps a peddler or vagabond. Catherine has emerged from her room at last, but seems altered. She speaks of Elizabeth in the present tense and has forbidden anyone to enter the child's bedroom, saying Elizabeth would not want her things disturbed." Marcus leaned forward. "This suggests Catherine knew what happened to her daughter." Keep reading," Margaret said quietly. Eleanor turned the page. "November 1st. I have discovered something terrible. Late last night I heard strange sounds from Elizabeth's room. When I crept from my bed to investigate, I found Catherine kneeling before the closet in Elizabeth's bedroom, speaking softly, as if in conversation. "Soon, my darling," she was saying. "Just a little longer and then we'll be together always." When she left, I looked in the closet but found nothing. Yet the lavender scent Elizabeth always wore lingered in the air. A chill ran through Eleanor as she recalled the lavender and camphor scent they had encountered when opening the hidden space. She continued reading. November 15th. I have learned the truth, though I can scarcely bear to write it. Catherine has been using laudanum since Captain Hadley's death. Dr. Morrison provides it to help her sleep, but I fear she has become dependent on its effects. Yesterday, in a moment of confusion, she mistook me for a grown Elizabeth and spoke of how she had kept me safe from them. When I asked who they were, she said, "The recruiters. They were coming for you next, just as they took your father. I couldn't lose you both." "My God," Marcus whispered. "She thought they would take Elizabeth for the war effort?" Catherine's mind was increasingly affected by grief and laudanum, Margaret explained. According to my great-grandmother's account, Catherine became convinced that Union recruiters would somehow take her daughter, despite the impossibility of such a thing. Eleanor turned another page. December 10th. Catherine speaks now of joining Elizabeth soon. I am frightened by her talk and have told father, but he dismisses my concerns as childish fancies. I tried to show him the hidden panel I discovered in Elizabeth's closet, a clever construction that reveals a small space behind, but found it sealed shut. I heard scratching from within, but could not open it. When I told father, he scolded me for making up stories about poor Elizabeth. The implications were becoming unbearably clear. Eleanor looked at Margaret, who sat with the composed dignity of someone long burdened with a terrible family secret. "You believe Catherine hid Elizabeth in that space?" Eleanor asked softly. "Not just hid her," Margaret replied. "Emma's later entries suggest Catherine kept her daughter sedated with laudanum, convinced she was protecting her. She likely intended to join her in death, but not before ensuring no one would find Elizabeth's hiding place." "But why didn't Emma tell anyone else?" Marcus asked. "She tried," Margaret said. "The final entries describe how no one believed her. A child's imagination, they said. By the time she was taken seriously, Catherine had died, the house had been sold, and the new owners had renovated, sealing the hidden space completely." Eleanor thought of the child's dress they had found, the porcelain doll with its cracked face, and the locket, a mother's keepsake meant for a daughter who never grew up to receive it. "The photograph led us to her," Eleanor said almost to herself. "After all this time." "What photograph?" Margaret asked. Eleanor hesitated, then decided that Margaret Carrington, of all people, deserved the complete truth. "A photograph of Catherine and Elizabeth that changed. It showed us what to look for, where to find her." Instead of the skepticism Eleanor expected, Margaret simply nodded. Emma wrote about a photograph that Catherine commissioned just before Elizabeth's disappearance. She claimed that in certain lights, the child's expression seemed to shift from solemn to frightened. The three sat in silence for a moment, each contemplating the tragedy that had unfolded over a century and a half ago. A mother's mind broken by grief and fear, a child hidden away and forgotten, a young sister unable to convince anyone of the truth. "What will happen to Elizabeth's remains?" Margaret finally asked. "Once the police investigation concludes, they'll likely be released for proper burial," Eleanor explained. "As her closest living relative, you would have the right to claim them." Margaret nodded. "I would like to have her interred beside her mother. Whatever Catherine did, she believed she was protecting her child. They should rest together now." As they prepared to leave, Margaret paused at the door. "There's one more thing you should know, Dr. Wright. The house has been sold again. The young couple who purchased it backed out after learning about the discovery." "I'm not surprised," Eleanor said. "Few people would want to live in a house with such a history." "Perhaps," Margaret agreed. "But Emma's journal mentions something else, something I've always wondered about. In her final entry about the Hadley house, written years later when she revisited it as an adult, she wrote, I felt them both there still, waiting, not in anger or in sorrow, but in patience. Time means nothing to those who wait for reunion. After Margaret left, Eleanor and Marcus returned to the conference room, the journal still open on the table between them. "Should we include this in our report?" Marcus asked. "It changes everything we thought we knew about the case." Eleanor considered the question carefully. "We'll document the journal as a new addition to the historical record. But as for what really happened in that house, what continues to happen there," she closed the journal gently. "Some things exist beyond historical documentation, Marcus. Some stories write themselves across time in ways we can only glimpse, never fully understand." Outside, the October afternoon was fading into evening, the early darkness of late autumn settling over the campus. As Eleanor gathered her materials, she found herself thinking about the photograph that had started their investigation, the image that had changed before their eyes, leading them to a truth hidden for over a century and a half. She wondered if, somewhere beyond the boundaries of time and understanding, Catherine and Elizabeth Hadley had finally found the reunion they had waited so patiently for. And she wondered what other stories might be waiting in the archives, their truths concealed in images and documents that only needed the right eyes to see them, to truly see them, across the vast distance of years. The Chicago winter arrived early that year, blanketing the city in snow by mid-November. Eleanor found herself increasingly preoccupied with the Hadley case, despite her efforts to move on to other research projects. The journal Margaret Carrington had entrusted to the archives provided historical validation for their discoveries, yet did nothing to explain the inexplicable aspects of their experience, the photograph that changed, the child's laughter fading through time. On a particularly bitter Thursday afternoon, Eleanor sat in her office, reviewing the forensic report that had finally been released. The DNA analysis had confirmed what they already knew. The remains found in the hidden closet belonged to a female child, approximately 6 years of age, who had died sometime in the 1860s. Cause of death was listed as undetermined, though the report noted trace evidence of laudanum in the preserved tissue, supporting the theory that Elizabeth had been sedated. A knock at her door interrupted Eleanor's reading. She looked up to find Marcus standing in the doorway, snow melting on the shoulders of his coat. "You need to see this," he said without preamble, placing a manila envelope on her desk. "What am I looking at?" Eleanor asked, opening the envelope to find several printed photographs of the Hadley house. "These were taken yesterday by the real estate agency. They're preparing to relist the property," Marcus explained. "Look at the third-floor window." Eleanor examined the image, a standard exterior shot of the Victorian home, now looking particularly somber against the snow-covered landscape. At first, she saw nothing unusual, but as she looked more closely at the third-floor window, the one that had once been Elizabeth's bedroom, she felt her breath catch. A small, pale face seemed to be looking out, one hand pressed against the glass exactly as they had seen in the historical photograph displayed on the computer screen that night in the archives. "This could be a reflection or a trick of light," Eleanor said, though she didn't believe it herself. "That's what I thought," Marcus replied. "So I went to the house this morning." Eleanor looked up sharply. "You went back? Alone?" He nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I told myself I was just being thorough. The forensic team finished their work weeks ago, and the house is empty now." He pulled out his phone and brought up a photo. "I took this from the street, same window, same time of day." The image on his phone showed the same view of the house, but the window was clearly empty, no face, no hand pressed against the glass. "I decided to check inside," Marcus continued. "Diane gave me access. She's as curious about all this as we are. The room is completely empty now, no furniture, nothing." "But," Eleanor prompted, sensing there was more. "But this was on the floor in the middle of the room." He reached into his pocket and placed a small object on Eleanor's desk, a tiny gold button engraved with an anchor design. Eleanor picked it up carefully. Civil War-era naval uniform button, she identified immediately, like one Captain Hadley might have worn. Exactly. But it wasn't there during the forensic investigation. They documented and photographed every inch of that room. And it wasn't there when the cleaning crew came through last week, according to Diane. Eleanor turned the button over in her palm, feeling its weight, the solid reality of an object that by all logic should not have been there. "It's as if something is still unfolding in that house," she said quietly. "Something set in motion when we found Elizabeth." Marcus took a seat across from her desk, his academic skepticism now tempered by their shared experiences. "I've been thinking about what Margaret Carrington told us, about time meaning nothing to those who wait for reunion. What if Elizabeth wasn't the only one waiting?" "Catherine," Eleanor murmured, "and perhaps even Captain Hadley." "The locket contained Catherine's image, and what we assumed was Elizabeth's hair," Marcus continued. "But what if it was meant as a connection between all three of them? A family separated by war and tragedy, waiting across time to be reunited." Eleanor considered this possibility. The historical record showed that Catherine had never recovered from the double loss of her husband and daughter. In her laudanum-induced state, perhaps the boundaries between life and death, between present and future, had blurred beyond recognition. "There's something else," Marcus said after a moment. "Diane mentioned that the new buyers are a military family. The husband is a naval officer recently returned from deployment. They have a daughter." The parallel was unmistakable, too precise to be coincidence, too meaningful to be random. Eleanor felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the winter chill seeping through her office window. "Should we warn them?" she asked, echoing the question Marcus had posed weeks earlier. "I don't think it's a warning they need," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "Whatever is happening in that house, I don't believe it's malevolent. If anything, it feels like completion, a story finding its proper ending." Eleanor nodded slowly, remembering the sound of a child's laughter, fading not in fear, but in what had seemed like joy. Perhaps some places retain not just trauma, but the possibility of healing, not just loss, but the potential for restoration. She picked up the forensic report again, looking beyond the clinical language to the human story it represented. A mother driven to desperate measures by fear and grief. A child hidden away in what was intended as protection. A sister who carried the truth through decades of disbelief. "The funeral for Elizabeth is scheduled for next week," she said. "Margaret has arranged for her to be buried beside Catherine as she wished. Will you attend?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "I feel connected to their story now, as if we were meant to find Elizabeth, to bring her home after all this time." Outside her window, the snow fell more heavily, transforming the campus into a landscape of white silence. Eleanor thought about the photograph that had started their investigation, an image that had somehow reached across time to ensure that a lost child would finally be found. "We should document this," she said, indicating the button. "Not as part of the official record, perhaps, but for ourselves. Some things can't be explained within academic frameworks, but that doesn't make them any less real or significant." Marcus nodded in agreement. "I've started keeping a personal journal about our experiences, not for publication, just to preserve what happened as we experienced it, without the filters of academic skepticism or institutional caution." Eleanor smiled at this admission. "The archivist being archived, there's a certain symmetry to that." As twilight deepened outside her window, Eleanor carefully placed the naval button in a small archival box alongside her notes on the case. Whatever was unfolding at the Hadley house, whatever had been set in motion by their discovery, was beyond her ability to fully comprehend. But she understood enough to recognize that some stories continued long after their principal characters had left the stage, resonating across time until they found the right audience, the right witnesses, to bring them to their proper conclusion. and she understood, with a certainty that transcended academic knowledge, that the final chapter of the Hadley family story was still being written, not in documents or photographs that could be preserved in archives, but in the invisible connections that bound past to present, the living to the dead, lost to eventual restoration. The day of Elizabeth Hadley's funeral dawned clear and cold, the cemetery a landscape of pristine white, broken only by the dark rectangle of freshly excavated earth beside Catherine Hadley's weathered headstone. Eleanor stood at a respectful distance as the small mahogany casket was lowered into the ground, containing remains that had waited over a century and a half for this moment. Margaret Carrington had arranged a simple service, attended by a handful of distant relatives and, somewhat surprisingly, the new owners of the Hadley house, Lieutenant Commander James Wilson, his wife Sarah, and their daughter Emma, a solemn child of 6 with searching eyes that reminded Eleanor of the face in the photograph. The coincidence of the daughter's name matching that of Catherine's sister seemed to reinforce the sense of cyclical completion that surrounded the entire affair. After the brief ceremony, Margaret approached Eleanor and Marcus, who had also chosen to attend. "Thank you for coming," she said, her breath visible in the cold air. "It feels right that you should be here after all you did to bring Elizabeth home. We were just doing our job," Eleanor replied, though they all knew their involvement had gone far beyond professional obligation. Margaret smiled slightly. "Nevertheless, I believe some things happen for a reason. Your discovery was meant to be." She glanced toward the Wilson family, who were placing flowers on the small grave. "Just as I believe they were meant to find the house." Eleanor followed her gaze, watching as young Emma Wilson knelt in the snow to arrange her bouquet more carefully on the fresh earth. "Have they experienced anything unusual since moving in?" "Sarah mentioned that Emma has been having conversations with an imaginary friend," Margaret said quietly. "A little girl named Elizabeth who used to live in her room. She thought it might be because they'd told Emma about the house's history." Marcus and Eleanor exchanged glances. "And that doesn't concern them?" Marcus asked. "Quite the opposite," Margaret replied. "Sarah said Emma told them Elizabeth is happy now because her whole family is together again. The commander said it gives him comfort after his last deployment. He lost men under his command, carries that weight heavily. He says the house feels peaceful to him." As they spoke, Eleanor noticed Emma Wilson looking in their direction with unusual intensity. After a brief exchange with her mother, the child approached them, clutching something in her mittened hand. "Are you the lady who found Elizabeth?" she asked Eleanor directly. Eleanor knelt to the child's level. "Yes, my colleague and I found her while researching the history of your house." Emma nodded seriously. "Elizabeth told me to give you this. She said you dropped it." She opened her hand to reveal a small, tarnished brass key, old-fashioned, with an ornate bow and a simple bit. Eleanor had never seen it before, but accepted it carefully. "When did Elizabeth tell you this?" she asked gently. "Last night," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "She doesn't come very often anymore. She said now that she's with her mama and papa, she doesn't need to stay in the house. But she wanted to make sure you got your key back." Before Eleanor could respond, Sarah Wilson called her daughter back to their side. Emma ran off through the snow, leaving Eleanor holding the mysterious key. "I've never seen this before," she told Marcus and Margaret. "It's certainly period-appropriate for the 1860s, but it's not something I lost." Margaret studied it with interest. "It looks like a diary key." Many journals from that era had small locks, not for security so much as privacy. The suggestion triggered a memory. Eleanor reached into her bag and removed Emma Hadley's journal, which Margaret had donated to the archives. The small leather-bound volume had no visible keyhole, but as Eleanor examined it more closely, she noticed a slight irregularity in the binding, a narrow slot concealed within the leather spine. With careful fingers, she inserted the key into this hidden aperture. It fit perfectly. When she turned it, they heard a faint click, and the binding relaxed slightly. Gently separating the back cover from the final page, Eleanor discovered a hidden compartment containing a folded piece of paper and a small daguerreotype she had never seen before. The photograph showed the complete Hadley family, Catherine, Captain James, and Elizabeth, posed formally but with genuine smiles that were unusual for photography of that era. The paper proved to be a letter in Catherine's handwriting, dated October 15, 1863, 2 days before Elizabeth's disappearance. "My dearest Emma," Eleanor read aloud, "if you are reading this, then what I fear has come to pass. The visions that have plagued me since James's death have grown stronger. I see men coming for Elizabeth as they came for her father. I cannot lose her too. By the time you find this, we will be gone from this world of sorrows. Do not grieve for us. We will be together, the three of us, as we were meant to be. In time, perhaps you will understand. Your loving sister, Catherine." The three stood in silence, the cemetery quiet around them save for the distant sound of cars passing on the road beyond its gates. The Wilson family had already departed, leaving only a caretaker who waited patiently by the open grave, ready to complete his work once they left. "She planned it," Marcus said at last. "Not just hiding Elizabeth, but her own death as well. A murder-suicide driven by delusion," Eleanor added softly. "Yet somehow across time they found a way to communicate, to influence events in our world." Margaret took the letter and photograph, studying them with a complex expression. "My great-grandmother carried the guilt of not being able to save Elizabeth all her life. She would be comforted to know they've found peace at last." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Eleanor found herself looking back at the fresh grave beside the weathered headstone. The Wilson child's words echoed in her mind. "She doesn't come very often anymore. She said now that she's with her mama and papa, she doesn't need to stay in the house." Some academic part of her still searched for rational explanations. Coincidence, suggestion, the power of narrative to shape perception. But another part, perhaps the more essential part, understood that some truths existed beyond the reach of documentation, beyond the capabilities of historical research to fully capture. "What will you do with the key?" Marcus asked as they reached their cars. Eleanor considered the small brass object now warm from her hand. "Return it to the archives," she decided, "with a note about its discovery. Future researchers may make of it what they will." 1 year later, Eleanor stood in the main gallery of the Chicago Historical Society, surveying the newly opened exhibit, Hidden Histories, Rediscovering Chicago's Past. At its center stood a glass case containing the artifacts from the Hadley investigation, the locket, the naval button, Emma's journal open to its revealing pages, and the key that had unlocked its final secret. The exhibit had drawn significant attendance since its opening 3 days earlier. Eleanor had agreed to give a public lecture that evening, focusing on the methodological aspects of their research, while carefully sidestepping the more inexplicable elements of the discovery. As she made a final review of the displays, Eleanor noticed a family entering the gallery, Lieutenant Commander Wilson, his wife, and their daughter Emma, now 7 years old. They hadn't spoken since the funeral, though Eleanor had heard through Margaret Carrington that they were settling well into the house, with no further unusual occurrences. Emma spotted Eleanor and waved excitedly, breaking away from her parents to approach. "Dr. Wright, did you like the picture I drew? Dad said you put it in your show." Confused, Eleanor smiled at the child. "I'm sorry, Emma. I don't think I've seen your picture." The girl pointed confidently toward a small frame in the corner of the display, a frame that Eleanor was certain had been empty when she'd checked the exhibit an hour earlier. It now contained a child's drawing of 3 figures standing before a house, with a 4th, smaller figure floating above them, depicted with wings. Sarah Wilson joined them, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Emma's been talking about this exhibit for weeks. She insisted we come today specifically." She looked at the drawing and frowned slightly. "That's strange. Emma, did you bring your picture with you?" "No, I gave it to Elizabeth to give to Dr. Wright," the child replied with perfect confidence. She said she'd make sure it was in the right place. Eleanor felt the familiar chill that had accompanied their investigation from the beginning. "It's a lovely drawing, Emma. Can you tell me about it?" "That's our house," Emma explained, pointing to the simple structure. "And that's me and Mom and Dad standing in front. And that's Elizabeth up there. She has wings now because she's with her Mom and Dad in heaven. She doesn't need to stay in the house anymore, but she still visits sometimes." Sarah smiled apologetically at Eleanor. "She has such an imagination. We've tried to be honest with her about the house's history, but in an age-appropriate way." "Of course," Eleanor replied, though her eyes remained fixed on the drawing that had somehow materialized in her carefully curated exhibit. As the Wilsons moved on to other displays, Marcus joined Eleanor, having just arrived for the evening lecture. He immediately noticed her distracted expression. "What's wrong?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," he joked, then quickly sobered when she didn't smile. "Look at that," she said quietly, indicating the framed drawing. "It wasn't there an hour ago. I'm certain of it." Marcus examined the drawing, then the family now viewing a display across the gallery. "The Wilson child?" Eleanor nodded. "She says she gave it to Elizabeth to deliver to us." Instead of the skepticism Eleanor might have expected a year ago, Marcus simply nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I've been thinking about this case a lot while preparing my dissertation. What if what we experienced wasn't so much a haunting in the traditional sense, but a kind of temporal folding?" "Temporal folding," Eleanor repeated. "Points in time connecting directly to one another, bypassing the years between," he explained. Catherine Hadley's mind was already fragile from grief and laudanum. What if, in that state, she somehow perceived across time? What if the men coming for Elizabeth she feared weren't from her time at all, but from ours, the forensic team, the investigators? And the theory was outlandish by any academic standard, yet it held a certain elegance that appealed to Eleanor's sense of narrative cohesion. So she hid Elizabeth to protect her from us? From people who wouldn't exist for another century and a half? "And the photograph changed to guide us to her," Marcus continued. "Not out of vengeance or restlessness, but because we were always meant to find her, to reunite the family in death, as they couldn't be in life." Eleanor considered the drawing again, the winged figure floating above the Wilson family. "A story writing itself across time," she murmured, "finding the witnesses it needs to reach its conclusion." Indeed, as visitors began to gather for her lecture, Eleanor found herself thinking about the nature of history itself, not as a linear progression of documented events, but as a complex tapestry of interconnected moments, some visible to conventional research, others accessible only through more intuitive channels. The Hadley case would appear in academic journals as a methodological case study in archival research, leading to significant historical discovery. Eleanor's lecture would focus on the documentary evidence, the forensic analysis, the historical context of the Civil War era that shaped the family's tragedy. But the true story, the one that had unfolded across more than a century and a half, reaching from a photograph that changed before their eyes to a child's drawing that appeared as if from nowhere, that story would remain largely untold, preserved only in Marcus's private journal and in Eleanor's own changed understanding of her profession's limitations and possibilities. As she prepared to address the waiting audience, Eleanor glanced once more at the Wilson family, now seated in the front row. Emma smiled at her with an awareness that seemed to transcend her 7 years. And for just a moment, a brief, impossible moment, Eleanor thought she saw another child standing beside her, a solemn-faced girl in a Civil War-era dress who nodded once before fading from view. Eleanor smiled and began her lecture, speaking not just about what could be documented and verified, but about the spaces between recorded facts where human experiences continued to resonate across time, waiting only for the right witnesses to bring them at last into the light.